Okay, it looks like the recording is started. Hopefully this all works out. Thank you all for coming today, and hopefully we'll get our technical things sorted out in the next couple of weeks. I'm hoping that next week will be smoother. But yeah, welcome back from spring break. Hope you had a very restful break, and I hope you got some time to not think about school. We are back here in class now, but we're going to be talking about advanced prototyping today. I think this is a pretty interesting lecture personally. We're kind of jumping into the content now that's getting a little bit more advanced. Hello. Can you hear the, okay, cool, audio is back. But yeah, so week 7, 8, and 9 are kind of talking about the more advanced versions of things that we've discussed in the class. So in week 5, we talked about prototyping as an introductory level, and we haven't really required it on any assignments yet. But with advanced prototyping, we're going to go into a little bit more of the theory behind animation, and also some of the new features in Figma that are going to be able to superpower your prototypes in the future. So yeah. We'll get started. Again, we're going to talk about a prototyping recap. We know that it was assigned in week 5, but we haven't had to do it since that homework, and we haven't talked about it on the midterm. So we'll do a really quick recap of it conceptually. And we'll talk about Smart Animate, which I think is one of the coolest features in Figma. It's something that's pretty unique to Figma as a platform as well. It's going to be able to make your work stream a lot faster for a lot of things where you need to mimic interactions really quickly. We're also going to discuss why it's important to rename all of your layers, and then talk a little bit about animation as a concept, and then we'll wrap up for today. The forms are here, as you can see. The attendance form is bit.ly/FDSP22 lecture 8 as per usual, and the lecture file is there as well. Annie, can you actually send those into the chat really quick? Thank you. But yeah, as per usual, we have the attendance form and the lecture file for today. Let us know if there are any issues accessing either of those things. All right, we're just going to jump right into this recap. So we've talked a little bit about prototyping and what it's used for, but essentially it's the idea of turning your design concepts into something that is a little bit more tangible. So the ability to add interaction and understand how users are going to actually behave when they interact with your product is going to give you a lot better of an idea of what you should be building, and basically inform your design decisions as you go through the process, because there is a pretty steep disconnect between looking at static screens, especially on a file, for example, where you have kind of the entire app in front of you at once, versus when you actually start to use the product as a customer, or as the end user or the client or whoever it is. And you're going to actually be interacting and swiping through screens, clicking on things, dragging things. It's going to be a completely different experience. So prototyping within Figma allows you to kind of mimic that experience by adding interaction to your own design work. It's essentially forming connections between two objects within a frame, or switching between frames. So it allows designers to define what happens when a user interacts with A and how to get from point A to point B. You can have multiple connections within a particular object in a frame. So what we talked about before was like the Instagram bookmark feature. You can also see an example right here in Figma, where if I hover over this, you have one interaction where the lecture 8 text becomes lighter, versus if I click on it, it actually opens up that page. So that's one kind of trigger, or one kind of like object that has multiple triggers that lead to multiple different kinds of animations. And you can also, again, have just a lot of different things interacting with each other on a particular screen. So like looking just at like this screen right now, there are a lot of clickable targets, like everything in the MacBook kind of bar, everything within Figma itself, everything within, like for me right now, the Zoom bar, which you guys can't see now, but if you're watching on Zoom, there's a lot of things that you can interact with, click on, change, that are going to be functioning differently. The three main components of any given prototype interaction that you want to remember are the trigger, the action, and the animation. The trigger determines what the user's kind of input is. The action is going to be what the product then does. And the animation is going to be how the product does it. So trigger is the user behavior, click, drag, press, that kind of thing, something that you do physically to the product. The action is what's going to happen on the screen, what point A and point B are. And then animation is how you're getting there. The animations are a little bit what we're going to talk about more today, where we've discussed, the basic concepts of triggers and actions. We haven't gotten into what you can do with these animations. And so if you have been doing prototyping, it's very likely that most of them have been instant, where you just kind of immediately switch the screen. But if you actually look through a lot of the apps and the things that you use day to day, Very rarely will you see a complete like instant change in things. Like one example is maybe clicking on a tab, but even that has a little bit of a delay and it has a little bit of a pre-interaction where it has this hover state. So we're going to talk about how to make your prototypes a little bit more complex. So these are the animations that are provided within Figma. You have dissolving, which is pretty straightforward. If you've ever used a PowerPoint presentation, you probably used the dissolve functionality at some point. Moving in and moving out. This idea of physicality on your screen, I find really interesting. So obviously when you're using like a digital surface, there isn't actually like two objects next to each other. There's not actually two screens that are next to each other, but the way that we perceive them is still that way. And so a lot of the time you're going to see things that are being moved in, moved out, pushed out of the screen, pushed into the screen. And a lot of these are going to be acting as if you have maybe different pieces of paper that you're kind of shuffling around your desk, or if you are basically looking at a viewport of like a physical item. So while you might not necessarily be able to map out, say, a website with all of these things, you're interacting with it almost as if it is a physical object. One basic example that you can think of is when you're scrolling on a web page. There isn't necessarily a reason why that's the way that we've designed the internet, but the idea of scrolling on a page makes it feel like, oh, this website is just really long, and I can kind of imagine that it's physically long underneath the area that I can see, so you're pushing it up in your viewport. So thinking about digital products as something that's kind of physical, and that's how we conceptualize it in our minds, is going to help you create better interactions, because this idea of like logically, what is to the left of this screen? What is to the right of this screen? If this menu icon is on the left side, do I want to come out from the bottom or the left? Understanding physicality within UI UX can be really helpful to you. Cool. So with that, Smart Animate is kind of this thing that I keep alluding to, where you are able to create really seamless and really easy interactions. So Smart Animate basically looks for matching layers that exist across multiple frames. And so this idea of matching is that piece of why we're going to talk about renaming importance. So Figma is going to look for layers that are matching in like the type of item they are plus the name. And that will signal to the software that they are related to each other in some way. And then it'll identify something that has changed about them and thus be able to animate between them very seamlessly. So it takes a lot of the guesswork out and basically allows you to have things that look very smooth. So in this particular example, you can kind of think about what is matching across all of these screens. So this navigation bar, for example, it stays exactly the same across all three, whereas this middle card appears to change. And what you can actually see here is that this card says it's one coast track. It is somehow interacted with the option to remove it, and then it is gone. And in its place, this part has moved up. So you see that the bottom two cards on the first two screens move up to be the second and the third card on the third screen. So in this interaction, which we're actually going to demo later, we're going to actually prototype how to do this in Figma. You can identify what things are matching and what things are related to each other. So this is an example of this particular interaction basically prototyped. So what they've done here is that if you can barely see, there's a tiny bookmark icon. They click on the bookmark so that they want to remove it from their favorites. They confirm it and then it disappears. And that piece there where this seamlessly moves up without kind of dissolving awkwardly, and instead it just kind of goes up, is what Smart Animate is doing there. So you can select Smart Animate from the list of different transitions when you're building out a prototype. Like we talked about earlier, it's under the animation section. And you can also apply Smart Animate with other transitions to basically create things that are very, very seamless. These examples that you see here, I think actually are all made with Smart Animate inside of Figma. You can see that these are quite complex, I think, compared to a lot of the stuff that you might think of by default, but you're able to do a lot of really interesting things and basically create more interactive prototypes that are going to more closely mimic what you might actually be building once it's actually, developed or coded or whatever it is that you're creating. So just kind of looking through these examples, and now they're going kind of quickly, we can think about what they might be doing. So this has a drag, and then you see, okay, this is going way too fast for me to actually describe these in detail, but we'll kind of talk about some examples later. But start to think about, what parts of these, where are the elements that are moving? What are the elements that are remaining the same? And in what ways are they changing? So Smart Animate can be used to create different types of animations, from loading sequences like this one, scrolling that's a lot more complex, touch gestures, switches, drop downs, pull to refresh, that kind of thing. And even for illustration, which I'll show, because I find that the illustrations are a little bit easier to understand. This is another example of something that could be created in Smart Animate. So in that moment there, you saw these squares and these circle objects kind of moving from left to right very seamlessly. If you were to actually, like, let's say we wanted to animate this by hand. Most animation runs at 24 frames per second, which means that you have to have 24 drawings every single second. So I'm somebody who's working at, this company that needs to make this icon. I have to draw, I don't know, let's say this is a 2-second long animation, 48 frames in order to do this, which would be a lot of time. And I don't think that you really hear about UI UX designers or product designers, making 48 individual frames every time they have to make a loading animation. So in Figma, instead, the shortcut here is to kind of identify what the main keyframes are, which we're going to talk about in a second. And then Figma is going to really smartly fill in the gaps for you. It can figure out, this is going to move from the left to the right. So in every millisecond or whatever, I'm going to move it this much. It does all of that complicated in-betweening for you already. This is another example of this kind of pull to refresh animation, where it's you're going to have the user drag something down. These dots are going to change in size for you really quickly and easily. Then it's going to refresh and pull, drag back up. And then this is another example of kind of a hidden drop-down menu that you can do through Smart Animate, because all of these objects are physically underneath and they kind of move up and are hidden once you decide to interact with it. Okay, so properties of animation as a concept. This is coming from like a staff of people who are just generally interested in animation beyond UI UX. So we've infused a little bit of that into the content. But keyframes are what I kind of just mentioned. So keyframes in animation are drawings that define the starting and ending points of any smooth transitions. So these define what an action is. It's kind of those like important moments where if somebody is walking, you can think of the keyframes as these 5 particular steps. So the point of contact, going kind of a change in your level, moving your lift, or you're moving the other leg back up, moving the leg up higher, and then contacting again. This is how you would understand a walk cycle before you kind of go into drawing all of the individual frames that are in between. This is how we understand walking. So it's got all of those key points, key frames that are critical in communicating basically what we want to tell the audience. At the end of the day, most kind of digital design work and most kind of visual design work is about communicating something to the audience that isn't physically there in front of you. There's obviously not an actual man walking in front of me, but the way that this is animated gives me the illusion that there is somebody walking. So animations and actual animation industry can be extraordinarily complex, even for really basic movement. This example here is this idea of squash and stretch, which is, I think, a lot of the time one of the most key or fundamental or basic lessons that they teach you if you're learning animation. So when you take a ball, I don't have a ball on me, but when you actually carry it and you see it kind of bouncing, you might not think of it necessarily as changing in its shape. However, if you want to communicate that in a limited number of drawings, it's helpful to exaggerate that sense of squash and stretch. So squashing and stretching is understanding how a shape can distort itself when it's moving in a particular trajectory. So in this case, you have the ball stretching out to be longer when it's falling to communicate the feeling of it being affected by gravity. And then when it hits the ground and it contacts the ground, it flattens out until it kind of squashes. And even though an actual ball might not move this much, it gives you this illusion of movement and kind of character and personality. So each keyframe has to be necessarily drawn out and specified, even with smart animation, where in this case, the keyframes would depend on how much you want to exaggerate each of the objects. So you can think of animation as the evolution of a state over time. A lot of the time when you're thinking about UI UX, you have a lot of the same kind of elements on all of your screens, and you're not necessarily moving them in or out, but they're kind of changing in their state. So seeing how an object transforms via scale, rotation, color, etc., helps us determine what keyframes that we need to create for whatever animation that we need to portray. So this is a really easy kind of example to wrap your head around, just an on-off switch. There's 2 basic states to this, an on state and an off state, wherein one of them has a blue and to the right and one of them is gray to the left. Those are 2 easy states that we can flip between, and in Smart Animate, we'd only need to actually create 2 frames, and then Figma will be able to fill in the rest for you in between. So running through a couple of quick examples of what Smart Animate can actually affect. Scale is first. If you have one circle small and one circle big, Smart Animate will figure out all of the middle sizes for you in this example. Position is another one where if you have a starting and ending position, Figma will fill in all of the blanks for you. So having these 2 frames is sufficient for Figma being able to apply the Smart Animate This is essentially recognizing the object's X and Y coordinates very easily and then animating the object moving from its current position to its destination frame. Opacity is also going to be really interesting, where you can have objects appear to fade in and out if you have the opacity altered. So this allows you to give the impression of something like say in this example, a bottle being filled or this droplet kind of going away. So you can adjust opacity to make an object appear or disappear between frames really easily. You can kind of hack your way through this as well. Rotation, I think this is a pretty trippy example where the squares all appear to be rotated a certain amount. And so Figma takes the angle of rotation in kind of its own properties of every particular object and applies that rotation to each object on its own or as a group if you have it grouped. So they can be rotated around a single anchor point if you choose to do so. Fill, this is pretty straightforward. It can change the colors. I think the way that the Figma software actually identifies what colors to transition between is pretty interesting. So it's able to seamlessly change from this blue to this green with all the in-between colors without you having to kind of decide what they're going to be. Okay, so with advanced prototyping, we're going to be discussing a little bit about how to actually apply these in Figma and the tool itself. Are there any questions before I kind of jump into that? Right, so with the smart animate transitions, you're going to be able to use them in the prototyping panel. So we talked about this before. It's essentially the same functionality. When you want to connect two frames, you can click on an object where an anchor point will appear with a plus sign and just directly drag it out into the next frame. In this example, you can kind of think about how is this going to actually animate, or what is this actually going to look like when it's applied? So if I had this in my particular app or whatever it is that I'm using, if it's instant, once I click on this larger square, it'll immediately become the smaller one. Whereas if I have smart animate, it's going to smoothly become smaller for me. To actually apply these, just the technical aspect of this and how to do it within Figma, you open the prototype tab in the right sidebar. Again, that's going to be right here. So if I open this up, prototype tab is right over here. I can then connect two frames together to create the interaction. And then once this kind of modal pops up, you define the interaction in the sidebar by choosing the trigger and the action. So normally that's going to be a lot of the time on click or on hover. And then the action is typically going to be navigate to or replace with in some way. And the animation section, all you have to do is select Smart Animate and then apply whatever kind of easing and duration that you choose to have. This gives you a lot more flexibility over, say, how long does animation take? If I want this to be a loading animation, maybe I want to take quite a while. If I want this to be instant, it can be pretty instant. And then adding this easing curve is going to tell you how quickly it's going to interact. If you want to combine other transitions with Smart Animate, you're able to do so by following these directions, where if you want to smart animate certain parts of a particular screen, like say you have an entire screen that's going to navigate to a second one, you can have some of it ease in and out, you can have some of it be pushed, but if there are matching layers that Figma detects, it can ignore whatever primary animation you've applied and instead override those with Smart Animate. So layers that do match are going to Smart Animate themselves. So say that means it'll stay in the same place instead of easing in and out, or it'll change in its size instead of kind of being pushed out. Whereas layers that don't match will use the main transition that you select. So this is an example that we're able to follow a little bit better. So when we preview this transition, we can see how the content moves from one frame to the next. So in this example, you see that the majority of the screen is moving from the right to the left. However, this bottom navigation bar remains the same, whereas the selected object just moves. So the whole bar itself, if we had not applied Smart Animate, would also be going to the left with the entire screen, but because it's smart animated, it remains static. It does not move and instead just shifts between the states that we have on this example. So with that, we're going to go into a quick demo. Afterwards, we can take a quick break. This is a pretty short lecture, so we'll be able to get through it pretty quick. But we're going to go into this demo that we talked about before. And I will pull it up here. If you have the file open, it's just the second page. It says demo. But before that, I want to go into a couple of really quick examples. So if you want to go into the Smart Animate examples page, you might have an extra one that I since deleted, but you can ignore that example. I realized it actually uses dissolve rather than Smart Animate. So I'll play through these really quickly. These are some illustrations that I made actually for a slide deck that I think communicate the basic properties of Smart Animate pretty quickly. So this is an example where there's just two keyframes. So there's two different states where all the music notes are, and Smart Animate is going to like smoothly animate them in and out and kind of up and down. So with that, I want to really quickly show you how you can modify the properties. So if I go here and I change, as you can see, it's just two keyframes. So this first keyframe is going to just seamlessly go into the second one, and both of these have an interaction. They just kind of move on delay, which is why it's kind of a GIF and it's like moving on its own. But if I go ahead and click on this and I want to say that I want the ease in, or I want the duration to be much shorter, let's say it's 600 milliseconds instead of 112. You can see that it's going to just interact a little bit faster here. I can speed it up a little bit more to exaggerate this interaction as well. But yeah, you see that it kind of smart animates it up and then down very quickly. So if you are doing smart animate, it's important to be conscious of the duration and kind of the easing curve of anything that you're doing. This example has a little bit more of rotation. So you can see the way that these objects are going to rotate without having weird dissolving or having weird transparency issues. So the smart animate is just going to seamlessly turn objects very nicely for you. This example, I think, looks a little bit more complex, but it is also just talking about the X and Y location. So by being able to move these objects around and rotate them as well, we have this illusion of like a violin being played in this particular demo. Cool. All right, I will go ahead and go into the demo. If there's any questions, feel free to message into the chat, but we'll go ahead and go into this. So we can walk through what this is supposed to look like first. This is a basic version of one of the examples that we saw in the slides. So it has this destinations app. From here, I can click on the bookmarks and see what destinations that I have previously bookmarked. As I click on it, you see the restaurants, Berkeley Social Club, and Gather. However, I've decided that I actually don't like Gather anymore. So this is an interaction that you're going to see frequently in existing apps where you can swipe to delete. So in this case, I'm going to click and drag. Once I let go and I move my mouse out of the area, it's going to delete the item that I chose to delete. And then I can then undo by pressing this, and then it'll animate back in very smoothly through Smart Animate. So with that in mind, we're going to go ahead and try this example directly here. So I'm going to make a copy of this particular screen. Sorry, I'm not used to using this. Okay, so I've made a copy of the screen, and then I'll make a copy of the screen as well. The first interaction that we saw was that clicking on the bookmark icon brings you to the actual bookmarks page. So I'm going to go ahead and prototype. I click, oh, sorry, it's going to duplicate all of these. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the bookmark vector itself, and then add a interaction that goes to this entire screen. And then I want this to, let's see what it actually does. You see that it's been pushed. So if I do that one more time, it's going to push to the left while everything else is smart animated. So I'm going to have this instead of saying instant, I'm going to have it push and then say smart animate matching layers. So while I do this, I'm going to go ahead and open up the prototype as well so that we can make sure we're doing this correctly. And I'll go ahead and click this. So now that I've had this smart animate interaction added, you can see that when I click this, all of these items are going to be pushed, whereas the text here and the navigation bar on the bottom do not. If I were to unclick Smart Animate Matching Layers, it will not do that, and the entirety of the screen will be pushed instead. So in this example, when I click here, everything is pushed instead of just having the content in the middle be pushed. I don't want that. Your app shouldn't really be doing that. So I'm going to click Smart Animate Matching Layers. And then from here, I'm going to allow this to be pushed back as well. I'll do the same thing. And Figma is actually pretty smart here where it identifies it's going to push in the opposite direction because I kind of moved the thing left itself. So now I'm able to go back and forth between these screens, or actually I was wrong, Figma's not smart enough to do that. Now it's going to be able to move back and forth between these screens if I click between these two icons really easily. So the next thing that I want to incorporate here is the on drag functionality of this particular screen. I'm going to delete this. Sorry, I realized that I forgot to actually put the preliminary screens in here. So I apologize if you're following along and having to delete all of these things at the same time. But I'm just going to copy these and then delete the interactions. Where now I'm able to say that on whenever I drag this middle tile right here that says gather, I want to go to this screen where the item itself is dragged, and Figma will be able to identify what has been moved. So it'll easily identify that for you. So I will say on drag, and then I want this to be smart animated. We'll see how this works. On drag, it smart animates, and then when I let go, it's not going to do anything yet because we haven't added the interaction for letting go. But you can see here that once I drag this out, I have a little bit of control over this. So I'm able to do this and back and forth, but when I let go, it's going to go right there. I'm going to also interact, or by good practice, also have this potentially be able to go back. You don't have to necessarily exhaustively prototype everything that you do, but while you're learning, I would recommend that you do things like this to make sure that you feel comfortable adding these interactions. So hypothetically now, if I were to get to this screen and drag this out in this weird middle state, I can still go back to the destinations page that I wanted before. And as you saw there, it wasn't quite going in the right direction. So I'm going to switch the push to be the way that I want it to. And now I'm going to be able to click here, drag this out, leave it there for some reason, and then go back if I need to. And the last part of this is going to be adding the undo button. Sorry about that. Lights will come back on if you wave your arms around enough, I think. But now we're going to go ahead and add the final screen. We'll be on a break in a moment, so I'll try to wave my arms around to get the lights to come back on. But let me just delete these interactions very quickly. Actually, I can go ahead and leave this one. So this one I'm going to have to just redirect here. And the last thing I want to do is say that when my mouse leaves this area, I'm going to be able to go to the next section. So as you see here, there's on mouse leave that triggers the next item. So I'm going to go here, add an interaction through this plus sign, drag it out here. And so instead of saying on click, I'll always say mouse leave. And I do not want it to push. I want it to simply smart animate the entire thing. So that's going to bring me right to here where this is going to kind of go up because these layers match, and it's going to look like this. Drag this out, leave, and then that's going to appear that way. If I want to undo it, all I have to do is add an interaction where if I click undo, it's going to bring me back here. And what that should do is push this back down and then bring back the item by dissolving it in. From here, smart animate, go back here, and now this is going to appear again. So that was a quick demo of Smart Animate. We can run through this one more time, where I start on the destination screen. I click here. I push most of the items that do not match, but if they do match, I keep them. And then I can drag this. When I let go and leave my mouse out of the screen, it's going to Smart Animate that away and then bring this up. Where if I undo, this is going to go back down. It's going to reappear. So that is Smart Animate in a nutshell. Are there any questions about anything that we've just done? In that case, we'll take a quick break. This is a pretty short lecture, so we'll go ahead and take like a 5-minute break and we'll come back at 6:46. I will pause the recording if I'm able to. Yeah, we'll be back at 6:46 in about 5 minutes. Hello, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get back to it. There's not too much left, and we're just going to talk a little bit about how to rename layers, and again, why it is really, really very, very important that you try to keep your layers named as appropriately as possible. As somebody who has a lot of rectangle 206 on their files, I totally understand that you can't always do it, but it's important to do it to the best of your ability. Before Smart Animate, it wasn't very clearly important why, or it wasn't very clear why it was important to name your layers correctly, but because Smart Animate and a lot of other prototyping things are reliant on layer naming and hierarchy, it does require that you pay a little bit more attention to your layer names. So luckily, there is a very quick way to rename your layers, and we're teaching you this because apparently a lot of people have never heard of this. When I was working at Figma, we actually found a lot of the employees had never heard of this modal. So here's your insider tip. You can actually view and update multiple layers at the same time. If you select multiple layers that say are matching in some way, like if you have a lot of the same button that you've created independently, so they all have different names. If you select all of them and then do Control or Command R, this little modal will pop up that allows you to batch rename things very quickly. So you can rename every layer, have them be the same name. You can add a suffix. You can even add the number that is associated with like the layer order in order to very quickly batch rename a lot of different things at once. So we do this very often when we're renaming the lecture slides. So what I can do is actually take an entire row of slides here. I'm going to go ahead and click and drag this. And what I can do is press Command R. And it's going to bring up this little modal right here, right? It might be a little bit hard to see. But what I can do is say like match things. If you're familiar with like CS, this is like regex basically. You can get pretty complicated with this. But in this case, all of these are named like A/1, A/2. Let's say I want to replace the letter A with, a random key smash. It's going to let me do that. So if I have nothing here, it'll just rename everything to what I have in here. But because I have these all named in a way, we can have some fun with this. So if I want to rename the slash and say like equals or something, I can also have it, put a whole piece of text here. You can see these previews are going to show me what I'm changing it to. And I can also do change the current name and then append something to the end of it. So if these are like the final versions, I can have it say the current name plus final. If these are an old version, I can say current name plus old. I can add something to the beginning and add like exclamation points here. One of my more interesting things that you can do here is the number system. So I can have these be slide and then number up or number down. These are going to be expressed through, it's very hard to see right now, a $sign and N. So if you have a $sign NN, it'll add 2 digits to everything. If I keep adding N's, it'll add more zeros at the beginning to make them fit. If I have less N's, it'll make them fit this way. And then a capital versus a lowercase is going to tell you if it's going to be ascending or descending. And it actually also lets you modify what number you start at. So this rename functionality is going to be really helpful if you ever need to organize your files. So even if you don't rename things as you go, at the end of it, before you let anybody ever see your file, you can go ahead and just batch rename everything and nobody will ever be the wiser. So we highly recommend that you check that out. Another way that you can identify really quickly what layers are related to each other and why renaming is important is this idea of matching layers. So when you think about an app itself, if you have a navigation bar, basically every navigation bar is going to function the same as every other navigation bar that you have in the app, which is why Figma came out with another feature called interactive components. That is something that is out of the scope of this class at the moment because it came out very recently and we haven't been able to write curriculum for it. However, you're going to be able to get a taste of like why this is important if you just hover over a particular layer. So in this example here, or I guess in right here, you can see that if I hover over this navigation bar, every other navigation bar that has the same name is going to also be highlighted to tell me that, hey, these are related to each other and they're going to function similarly. If you want to do this in your own file, all you have to do is open the prototype panel and then hover over any kind of object or layer, and then Figma will highlight all the other ones, which is helpful for debugging. So if you see that something that you think should be highlighted isn't highlighted, you get a sense that something here is wrong. So in this example with the music notes, if I hover over this treble clef on the left frame, you can see it's also been highlighted with a box. Same goes for all of these notes. These should be related. And if any of them don't, then there's going to be an issue in the Smart Animate. So I'll go ahead and just rename this to some random key smash. You'll see now that if I hover over this, that one in the accompanying frame is not highlighted, but the other ones remain highlighted. This means that if I go into the Smart Animate, it's not going to function the way that I want it to. Because it doesn't know what I'm trying to move, because Figma is only dependent on the name. It's not smart enough to just kind of guess at your head about what's going on there. So in this case, you see that most of the notes are moving up and down smoothly, whereas this 8th note is kind of weirdly like teleporting up and down because by default, Figma will choose to just use dissolve rather than Smart Animate. So this idea of hovering is going to help you debug. So if you have something that is doing that, like say one of the things isn't moving the way that you think it's going to, try hovering. If you see that it's not matching anywhere, go back, check the name, rename it. So I named this 8, which is also not appropriate, but this should now actually be fixed, hopefully. Yep, you can see that this is actually now prototyping the way I want it to. Any questions about anything relating to renaming? Smart Animate is able to track what elements are related to each other by checking the names. So if you have an object named the same way, it's the same type of object, Figma will know that they are related to each other. Yeah. Oh, moving on, we'll talk a little bit more about animation in UX and how to actually use animations effectively, and thinking about, in the actual day-to-day products that you use, what elements are animated. So these are 12 main principles of UX in motion. This is a lot to digest. I would recommend just watching one of them every time you look at the GIF. But animation should always be functional when you're thinking about a design like in an app. This is not to say that all animation must always be functional. We're talking mostly about practical UI UX design right now. If you want to get real crazy with it, you're more than welcome to. But if you're trying to be functional and serve a purpose to aid the user, you want to make sure that you're not detracting. So the reason why that you might not necessarily be very cognizant of animations in your apps right now is because they're made to feel hidden. If you notice them, a lot of the times, either they're purposely trying to make you notice or they've designed it kind of poorly. It's something that we've kind of mentioned in this class before, where bad things stick out, good things are going to be unnoticed. It's going to feel seamless and it's going to feel very smooth. So functional animation establishes hierarchy and relationships between groups of information. So in these, some clear examples would be this easing, where it's a square, instead of just moving directly from the left to the right, is going to pause a little bit in the middle, which functions a little bit more like actual physics, where if you were able to move something, you wouldn't just move it kind of like this very smoothly. I would have a little bit of momentum as I move my arm. Another example that we can go into here is overlay, where you're going to see this a lot in menus and things like that, where moving one object reveals something that is underneath it. It's literally overlaid on top. You can see this a lot in, again, like any kind of menu system where you have something come in often from the left, revealing something underneath it or revealing something on top of it. That idea of physicality kind of comes back that we mentioned earlier. So animation needs to sometimes feel natural, similar to how we animate objects, like we were talking in the larger scheme of animation beyond just UI UX. To a certain extent, animation follows the rules of physics via weight and speed, which you can do more successfully by using these easing curves. In this example, you see that this circle is not just going up and down, it's going a little bit too far and retracting back, as if it's kind of like moving my hand this way and then kind of moving a little bit extra at the ends to simulate how actual movement feels within the application itself. So the first case where you might need to be a little bit more focused on these kind of details is context. So a good way to indicate to a user that an action has been performed is to use animation. So in this example, you have a list of like constantly updating posts, and here having the post slide up instead of just appearing is going to be able to help the user understand more. So in this case, if they just kind of magically appear here, the user doesn't get a sense of like scrolling being necessary. However, in this case, the app itself is telling you like, hey, new things are appearing, and I'm going to tell you by pushing stuff down. And because it's being pushed down, you can imagine that the user thinks like, oh, if I want to see more, I can scroll up and down because the animation is telegraphing that to me. A good animation, like I mentioned before, is something that the user probably doesn't notice. But the purpose is to help you, you're just opening the app, things like that, where you don't really care about what's happening. You just need to get there quickly. You want to make sure that it feels subtle and it doesn't feel really distracting. So this is an exaggerated example on the left where like you load the app and everything flies at you from different directions, whereas an actually good approach would be to load the app and then have everything come up in the same direction. So in this case, not only do things come in from the bottom, this pink itself actually just squishes up to the top, I believe. So this is going to be a lot more easily telegraphed to the user, and they're going to be able to more intuitively, again, think like, hey, I need to be scrolling down. You don't want to be able to notice that kind of thing. And finally, what we talked about with physicality again, this idea of orientation is helpful in thinking of your 2D screens as like a 3D physical space. So animations should give a consistent sense of spatial orientation in order to help you navigate through something. So even if you're not thinking about it consciously, understanding, say, like the menu or the settings of an app to be on the left side and understanding the next functionality of your app to be on the right side is going to help your user orient themselves in a way that is expected. So the idea is always to make products that are intuitive, that can be that can be used without having to directly explain them to somebody. So in this example on the left side, you see that the basically profile does not appear where you expect it. So when I open here, you see that there is a right arrow. So I would expect it to move kind of to the left or the right, but instead it comes out from the bottom. And because it comes out from the bottom, I then expect it to leave by going back to the bottom, but instead it's being swiped up to the left. So here it comes from the bottom, then leaving on the left, whereas like the correct functionality has it appear very smoothly and then kind of go back. There's like a clear get from point A to point B and then from point B to point A in the same manner, that is really helpful in like understanding that mental schema. If I get from point A to point B and then my journey from point B back to point A goes in like a weird loop over here, that's going to be really confusing to me as a user. Whereas if I just go from here to here and here to here again, it's very intuitive. Animations should also honestly be part of the prototyping process. It's going to be very tempting to, like, as you go, default everything to be instant or to be dissolve. Honestly, defaulting things to just smart animate is going to get you like 60% of the way there most of the time, even if you haven't necessarily done a lot of debugging on your stuff already. For the most part, a lot of the ways that you're going to be building screens is duplicating what you already have. So you have the benefit of most of your layers already being named the same thing. So adding a little bit of just like clicking on smart animate every now and then when you're putting things together is going to give you a little bit more believability in your prototypes in the future. So while you're thinking about prototyping, don't just think about like point A to point B. Think about that step of animation and how you get from point A to point B and how that's going to affect the user's experience or understanding or comfort level or whatever it is about whatever you're creating. All right, that's going to be it for content today. We're going to go a really quick wrap up. I know that we're ending a little bit early today, so we can head home. But this week we do have homework and lab. I don't know why it's not going. This week's lab is going to delve into these smart animate properties. I think in a more digestible way. You're going to just be doing a couple of different examples that touch on how to actually implement these, so that you're familiar with the like technical aspect of it. So we're basically going to be using Smart Animate to put together a like smart home app with your TAs and your teams. And the homework this week is to do a Pokédex. It's going to be really fun, but you basically want to go deeper into prototyping by adding interaction to a Pokédex app. The TA that made this is a huge nerd, so there's a lot more detailed instructions on this homework because we know that prototyping can be quite confusing. He's gone in and added a lot of annotations to help you decide how to actually do things. Though ultimately it's up to you how you want to structure it. So you can dive into those instructions. There's quite a lot there's like a whole Notion document to help you with things because it's done in quite like a specific way. But let us know if you have any questions. We highly encourage you to come out to office hours or to just use Slack if you have any questions about this. I will try to respond to everything on Slack eventually. And our TAs are always going to be present at office hours to help you with anything like this. So the secret word for today is gather, G-A-T-H-E-R. That was one of the restaurants that was in the demo example. So again, that word is gather, G-A-T-H-E-R. And the form is going to be the same as usual. And then these are all the announcements that we have for the day. Do keep in mind that there is readings for this week as well. So there's both the Smart Animate Pokédex and the readings as per usual. Also, if you need an extension on your week 7 homework, if you just like slipped your mind because of break, just contact your TA or me and talk through an extension if we can figure that out. We always prefer that you do the homework eventually over not doing it at all because auto layout is going to be important for the final as well. So we want to make sure that you're adopting these skills as we kind of go. And then finally, if you found this really interesting or you really enjoy the concept of prototyping and interaction, we would highly recommend you check out interactive components. They're beyond the scope of this class because they're quite a bit more advanced than what we've talked about, but I'm happy to answer questions about it and like debug things with you if you want to try it on your own. And feel free to message on Slack if you have any questions about interactive components. That's all today. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week for illustrations. This is my favorite lecture next week. I really like this lecture, so see you next week. Thank you.